I'm Tawfik in New York, and this is BBC World News America. Russia launches a full-scale assault on Ukraine by land, air, and sea. A barrage of missiles hit multiple targets. Vladimir Putin has this warning.
Whoever tries to interfere with us or threaten our country should know that Russia's response will be immediate and lead to such consequences that have never been experienced in history.
In Ukraine's capital, Kiev, an exodus of fearful residents. President Zelensky calls on the international community to help.
Putin started a war against Ukraine, against the whole democratic world. He wants to destroy my country. He wants to destroy our country, everything we have built, everything we live for.
As Russia continues its advance, there are reports of casualties on both sides. The international community responds with more sanctions against Moscow.
Putin will stand condemned in the eyes of the world and of history. He will never be able to cleanse the blood of Ukraine from his hands.
Welcome to World News America on PBS and around the globe. Ukraine confronts the reality of war. A huge Russian military offensive is underway with attacks by land, air, and sea. Fighting is raging in the northeast and south hours after Moscow's invasion. Thousands of Ukrainians are seeking shelter or trying to flee to the safety of neighboring countries. And already in these early hours, there are reports of dozens of military and civilian casualties. Well, let's bring you up to date with events. In a televised address at around 6 a.m. Moscow time, President Putin announced a special military operation in the eastern Donbass region aimed at what he called the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. It came as missile strikes were reported on a number of Ukrainian military targets. Explosions could be heard in several cities in the east of the country, as well as the capital, Kiev. Russia said it's destroyed more than 70 military targets, including 11 airfields. And Ukraine says the Chernobyl nuclear plant has been captured by Russian forces. And following the airstrikes came the land invasion, with Russian tanks and troops advancing. They breached the border in three main directions, from the east, the south, and the north, including from Belarus, Russia's longtime ally. Well, we will discuss all angles of this conflict, the biggest attack on a European state since World War II. With the first of our reports tonight, our international correspondent Orla Guerin has the very latest from the front line in eastern Ukraine.
One of the opening salvos in Russia's war on Ukraine. A missile strike on an airport in the west of the country. In Kyiv today, a frightening new dawn for Europe and Ukraine. This city of 3 million awoke to sirens and an invasion. Soon, a panicked exodus from the Ukrainian capital as the EU spoke of one of the darkest hours since World War II. And darkened skies as Russian attack helicopters targeted a military airport outside Kyiv. Ukraine says several were shot down. The invasion was by air, sea and land. President Putin, who insisted it would never come, warning that no one should try to stop him.
Whoever tries to interfere with us or threaten our country should know that Russia's response will be immediate and lead to such consequences that have never been experienced in history.
Hours after he spoke, this was the picture in cities across the country. Images from Ukraine's northern and southern borders showed Moscow's forces streaming in. Ukraine's beleaguered president, Volodymyr Zelensky, addressed the nation, dressed for battle.
What do we hear today? It's not just rocket explosions, combat and the roar of aircraft. This is the sound of a new Iron Curtain, lowering and closing Russia away from the civilized world. Our national task is to make this curtain not on our territory, but in the homes of Russians.
Ukrainians were not safe in their own homes today. Here, the aftermath of a strike on a block of flats in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city. Missile fragments now on display in the playground. From early morning in eastern Ukraine, we found queues at ATMs. Now there is war, people want cash in their pockets and fear it may run short. Like many here, Natalia is trying to comprehend what has befallen Ukraine, trying to work out how to protect her 2-year-old Karina.
We're shocked. We're totally shocked. We are afraid for our children, for our families.
Are you thinking about trying to move?
Where can I go? We don't know where to go. Who will have us? Nobody, nowhere is waiting for us. I don't know, I just don't know.
More queues at the petrol stations. Many want to be ready for whatever may come, like Andrei, who felt the explosions overnight.
I heard it clearly. The earth was really shaking. So we got up and now we're waiting for fuel. We will buy some so we can be mobile in case all communications are cut. We have to prepare. What else can we do?
In the battle for Ukraine, Russia is controlling the skies. Here, Ukrainian forces respond with small arms fire. They are outgunned and have been suffering losses. We don't know how many. The attack is a projection of Russian strength and Western weakness. Frenzied international diplomacy and the threat of sanctions failed to stop it. This nation is now under sustained assault. A day has changed everything for Ukraine and for security in Europe.
That's Orla Guerin there in eastern Ukraine. Now, the BBC's Clive Myrie has been in Kiev and watching reaction there and from the international community, including NATO.
Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, made it clear that all those assurances that the Russians put out over the last few days and weeks, they were all lies. They were lies. Vladimir Putin had made up his mind a long time ago what he was going to do, and today he executed that plan. And as you say, it puts the people of this city, close to 3 million, and across the country, many, many millions, puts them in grave danger. Remember, 190, according to US and Western intelligence estimates, 190,000 Russian troops encircled this country for weeks to the north, to the east and to the south. And what we heard at around 5 o'clock this morning was the sound of air raid sirens going off, an announcement in Russia from Vladimir Putin that a major attack had taken place, and then the sound of the bombardment. Cruise and ballistic missiles being used, attacking military targets, according to the Russians. Then you had the ground assault, armored personnel carriers and tanks crossing over the border. And consequently, you've got fear and a sense of dread in this city that everything that the West was talking about has actually come to pass. And as a result, we're seeing panic and that sense of fear.
Now, the Kremlin insists its military operation in Ukraine will last as long as is necessary. President Putin, who announced the action early this morning, warned that any outside interference would lead to an immediate response never previously experienced in history. But there's a sense of shock among some ordinary Russians. From Moscow, our correspondent Steve Rosenberg reports.
There are moments that change the course of history. Would this be one? Russia invaded Ukraine. Its president threatened the West.
If anyone tries to stand in our way or even threaten our country, our people, they should know Russia will respond immediately. And this will lead to such consequences, the likes of which you have never experienced in your history.
Russian state TV went into overdrive, backing the assault, claiming Ukrainian soldiers were surrendering en masse. A different mood here, at one of Russia's last surviving independent papers. To show solidarity with Ukraine, tomorrow's edition will be in Russian and Ukrainian. The paper's editor, Dmitry Muratov, won last year's Nobel Peace Prize. He believes that President Putin has done irreparable damage to his country.
Unfortunately, I have to say very bitter words. I think that today, February the 24th, Russia's future was taken away from it. Our peace-loving Russian people will now feel the hatred of the world, because we are starting a third world war in the centre of Europe.
Vladimir Putin comes across now as a leader with an almost messianic idea to force Ukraine back into Moscow's orbit, even if that means war. What the public might think about that doesn't come into it. He seems determined to achieve his goal. The actions of a government can demonize a whole nation. But keep in mind, amongst the public here, there is little support for war with Ukraine.
I'm sorry, I'm so shocked. I just can't help crying. I think that most of Russians don't support this. It's horrible.
And why don't they support it?
Because it's not our war. It's war Putin, Biden or anyone else, but not our nation.
I think the Ukrainian soldiers will surrender, she says, and they should. It's terrible to be at war with Ukraine. In Moscow tonight, hundreds took to the streets. No to war, they chanted, determined to make their voices heard. But they were silenced. You can arrest people, but you can't force people to support the invasion of a neighbouring country. This is not a conflict the Russian public wants. This is the Kremlin's war. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
There has been a loud chorus of international condemnation, and NATO will convene a meeting of its 30 leaders on Friday to discuss next steps after Russia's invasion. Well, President Joe Biden has announced harsh new sanctions, along with the EU and UK, targeting Moscow's financial sectors, exports, and the country's elite. Take a listen to what world leaders believe is at stake, starting with President Biden.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies.
We will hold Russia accountable for this outrageous violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and the territorial integrity. And what is at stake is not just Donbass, it's not just Ukraine. What is at stake is the stability of Europe and the whole international order, our peace order. President Putin chose to bring war back to Europe. In a determined and united response, the European Union will make it as difficult as possible for the Kremlin to pursue its aggressive actions.
Putin will stand condemned in the eyes of the world and of history. He will never be able to cleanse the blood of Ukraine from his hands.
Russia has attacked Ukraine. This is a brutal act of war. Our thoughts are with the brave people of Ukraine. Sadly, what we have warned against for months has come to pass. Despite all calls on Russia to change course and tireless efforts to seek a diplomatic solution, peace on our continent has been shattered. We now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged to history.
Our State Department correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher joins us from Washington for more on those U.S. sanctions. So, Barbara, President Biden in his speech saying that these sanctions will hurt Russia's economic growth long term. How will they do that?
Well, Neda, they significantly isolate Russia from the Western financial system. So they cut off Russia's largest banks and largest state-owned companies from the Western financial markets. They also block the export of sophisticated U.S. technology that is vital for the Russian economy, vital for Russian industry to build everything from warplanes to smartphones. Now, they haven't gone as far as they could. They stopped short of cutting Russia off from the global interbank payment system known as SWIFT, although that could still happen yet in the future. But in the meantime, Russia still has access to parts of the global economy, especially if China keeps working with it. But its economy is still fairly integrated with the U.S. and especially with Europe. So these measures could have quite a substantial impact over time, as you said.
Well, you know, Biden also said that the U.S. and its partners imposing more sanctions make up half of the global economy. But I mean, isn't it worth noting that sanctions didn't work in the past? So why do they think they're going to work now?
That is definitely worth noting, especially as Russia has significant financial reserves, foreign reserves that it can use to cushion itself from the blow. But these are very tough measures. They've not been imposed before. They are very much aimed at squeezing the economy. Now, it's difficult if you're trying to do that because Russia is a major economic power. It's the 11th largest economy in the world. So if you try to strangle an economy like that, you're probably going to have pain yourself. So, for example, they have not targeted the energy sector because Russia is a major exporter of oil and gas, especially to Europe, and they don't want to disrupt the energy markets. Mr. Biden has himself said he's afraid that Americans might have to pay more at the pumps. He's also said that the sanctions could have some time to take effect, to the medium, to the long term, he said. So he's urged allies to show resolve and unity to hold the line for the long haul.
All right, Barbara Plett-Usher there for us with that analysis. Thank you so much. Now, on to some other developments. The price of oil has soared since Russian troops crossed the border into Ukraine. It surpassed $100 a barrel on Thursday for the first time in 8 years. Russia is currently the second biggest exporter of crude oil after Saudi Arabia and is also the world's largest natural gas exporter. News of Russia's actions have also led to steep falls on global stock markets as European gas prices have surged by more than 30% following the invasion. Europe is dependent on Russia for both oil and gas, with 40% of its gas supplies flowing through pipelines that cross Ukrainian territory. Russia has long been resisting Ukraine's shift towards the European Union, but President Putin's sense of grievance goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and even further to Russia's historic loss of territory and power. Our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, looks at what is motivating the Russian leader and what the invasion of Ukraine means for the global balance of power.
It's hard to avoid the feeling that the world as we've known it since the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 has changed for good. The Soviet Empire in Europe was finished and Western notions of freedom had triumphed. After almost 2 more years, the revolution had reached Russia itself. But after a hapless coup attempt by the KGB, Boris Yeltsin emerged as the man who would dismantle the old Soviet system and introduce much greater democracy. Yeltsin's eventual successor was an ex-KGB officer, Vladimir Putin. He always insisted he didn't want to revive the old Soviet Union, and he seemed to fit in well with the diplomatic niceties of a world which was now dominated by the United States. Yet all the time he was quietly rebuilding Russia's armed forces, which had fallen into decay. Putin was on a mission to make Russia a superpower again. The Western leaders, though, just saw him as someone they could do business with.
The problem is that they approach Russia with optimism and thinking that Russia can be engaged with like a Western liberal democracy, not realizing just how rapidly Russia is retreating back into its own historical comfort zone of hostility, not only to the outside world, but to its own population and to its own very specific view of history, where it nurses grievances that are just unrecognizable to the outside world.
Ukraine especially seemed to obsess him. He hated the way it had gone for independence when the Soviet Union collapsed. The pro-democracy Orange Revolution was an affront to him. By 2014, he infiltrated his soldiers into Crimea, which belonged to Ukraine, and completely contrary to international law, he just took it over. Western countries. A few months later, at a press conference in Moscow, I offered him the opportunity to say he didn't want a new Cold War. But he pointedly refused to say that.
It's all about protecting our independence, our sovereignty, and our right to exist.
And yet, the West still carried on doing business with Vladimir Putin as though he was just like any other leader. It was a classic case of self-deception. Putin's big supporter now is China under Xi Jinping. No condemnation over Ukraine from Mr. Xi. Suddenly, the world has changed. We're in new territory now, and it looks distinctly like Cold War Mark II. John Simpson, BBC News.
Well, with so many developments unfolding, let's go to our correspondent, Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. You know, Steve, we heard President Putin for weeks denying that he planned to invade Ukraine, and all the while during that shuttle diplomacy, he was planning one. In the end, what is he hoping to achieve in Ukraine?
Well, it's the key question, isn't it? I mean, what is motivating Vladimir Putin? Well, he's fueled by resentment at how the Cold War ended, with the West declaring victory and Russia losing its influence and power and territory. He's also motivated by what I'd call a sort of semi-religious belief that Ukraine has to be with Russia, has to be in Moscow's orbit. And he believes that Russia, as a great power, has the right to its own sphere of influence. He also feels that disdain, utter disdain, I think, for the West and for Western leaders. He looks at them as weak and he looks at them as disunited. Now, what can the West do about all of this? It's very hard to say, really, because the Kremlin will have factored in already Western sanctions. The Kremlin knows that America is not going to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. It's not going to fight on Ukrainian territory against Russia. The West does not want a war with Russia, and the Russians know that. But I would add this, that if you've been in power for 22 years, as Vladimir Putin has, as President and Prime Minister, then you start to feel you're invincible, and that's when mistakes creep in.
Well, and to that, Steve, we heard in your package earlier that there's little support from ordinary Russians for this war. How has this changed President Putin's standing in the country?
It's an interesting question. If you look back a couple of months, his rating actually went up. As we were in this period of what we thought may have been coercive diplomacy, Vladimir Putin had basically delivered an ultimatum to NATO and to America, demanding security guarantees. But there is a lot of, I'd say, unease here about this invasion of Ukraine, and that could affect his popularity.
All right, Steve, we have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you so much. I'm Tawfik here in New York. Thanks for watching World News America. Take care.